Death is the only honest teacher. It never lies about what you're worth when the mask falls off. You think you understand death. You think you've made peace with mortality. But here's what Epicurus knew that you don't. The moment you fear death, you've already handed your life over to a ghost. Most people live their entire existence negotiating with a corpse. They make decisions based on what might happen when they're gone. They chase immortality through legacy, through children, through monuments to their ego. They pray to gods, build savings accounts, seek approval, all desperate attempts to matter beyond the grave. Epicurus looked at this pathetic dance and said, "Stop. You're being enslaved by nothing." Here's the brutal truth he understood before anyone else. You cannot suffer what you cannot experience. When you're dead, there is no you to feel pain, regret, or loss. There's no consciousness to mourn what it's missing. The dead don't lie awake wishing they were alive because the dead don't lie awake at all. But the living. They torture themselves daily with fantasies of their own non-existence. This is the first law of death mastery. The corpse feels nothing, so the living man who fears becoming a corpse is suffering for someone who will never exist. Think about it. Every moment you spend anxious about death is a moment stolen from life by a future version of yourself that will never be conscious enough to thank you for the worry. You're literally sacrificing your present reality for nothing. Epicurus didn't just philosophize about this, he weaponized it. He turned death from humanity's greatest fear into his greatest source of power. Because once you truly grasp that death is complete annihilation of consciousness, something incredible happens. You become immune to threats that require you to be alive to suffer them. Religious manipulation. Powerless. Death threats. Laughable. Social shame about your legacy? Irrelevant. The man who has genuinely accepted that death is nothing doesn't negotiate with phantoms. He doesn't waste energy on cosmic approval. He doesn't modify his behavior based on posthumous judgment. He becomes ungovernable. But here's where most people misunderstand Epicurus. They think accepting death's nothingness makes life meaningless. It's the opposite. When you stop living for imaginary futures, you start living for actual present moments. When you stop trying to matter forever, you start mattering now. The Epicurean lives with the intensity of someone who knows the clock is running, and the freedom of someone who knows that when it stops, there won't be anyone left to regret the ride. This isn't nihilism. This is the purest form of life affirmation possible. Because every pleasure, every connection, every moment of joy becomes precious precisely because it's temporary. The sunset is beautiful because it ends. Love matters because it's finite. Your choices have weight because you won't get infinite chances to make them. Most people think mortality makes them small. Epicurus knew it makes you everything. For the brief, brilliant time you exist to experience it. Now let's get surgical about how this actually works in practice. The average person carries around an invisible tribunal in their head. Parents, society, God, future generations, all these phantom judges evaluating every decision. Epicurus realized something revolutionary. Dead men don't vote. When you die, the tribunal dissolves. The judges disappear. The courtroom goes dark. So why live as if you're on trial? This is where Epicurean philosophy becomes dangerous power. You stop performing for an audience that will never review your show. You stop living as if it's a dress rehearsal. You start living it as the only performance you'll ever give. Watch what happens to your decision-making when you strip away posthumous concerns. Take Steve Jobs. When diagnosed with terminal cancer, he didn't spend his final years worried about his legacy or what critics would say. He focused on creating what brought him alive: beautiful products, meaningful work, authentic relationships. The man who knew death was nothing lived more intensely than those who pretend they're immortal. Or consider someone facing a career change. The phantom tribunal asks, what if you fail? What will people think? How will you be remembered? But the Epicurean cuts through. What do I want to experience while I'm conscious? The choice becomes yours, not theirs. Every decision becomes cleaner when the dead can't judge it. But Epicurus went deeper. The fear of death doesn't just corrupt major decisions, It poisons daily experience. People hoard money they'll never spend, maintain relationships that drain them, pursue careers that bore them, all because they're unconsciously preparing for a future their consciousness will never witness. Consider the executive who works 80-hour weeks, building something that will last. Last for whom? His corpse won't care about quarterly reports. Or the person staying in a loveless marriage, for stability. Stability for what? The dead don't need security. The dead don't need your savings account. The dead don't care about your reputation. The dead aren't impressed by your sacrifices. Here's the most liberating realization. If you truly accept that you are a temporary arrangement of atoms that will disperse back into the universe, then every moment of consciousness becomes a miracle you didn't earn. You didn't choose to exist. You won't choose to stop existing. But right now, you have the impossible capacity to experience pleasure, beauty, connection. Not because you're special, because the universe randomly assembled itself into a pattern that can feel good about being alive. That's not meaningless. That's the most meaningful thing possible. The Epicurean doesn't seek to leave a mark on the world because the world doesn't have feelings. He doesn't chase immortality because consciousness is what makes experience valuable, and consciousness dies with the brain. Instead, he maximizes the quality of his temporary existence. He pursues genuine pleasure, not shallow dopamine hits, but deep satisfactions, friendship, beauty, knowledge, peace, authentic connection. He lives like someone who knows he's going to die, because he is. And he lives like someone who won't be around to regret anything, because he won't be. This creates a specific fearlessness. Not reckless immortality fantasies, but calm acceptance of the worst possible outcome, and the realization that it's not actually that bad. Take someone facing public humiliation. The average person spirals. This will ruin my reputation forever. But forever for whom? The Epicurean thinks, in 100 years, everyone who witnessed this will be dead. In 1,000 years, the civilization that cares about this will be gone. The universe will expand until the last star burns out, and none of this will have mattered to anyone. This isn't depression. This is liberation. Because once you realize that cosmic significance is impossible, local significance becomes everything. The conversation with a friend matters because you're both conscious right now. The sunset is beautiful because you can see it today. Love is precious because it exists in the present moment between two temporary beings. What can you threaten a man with if he's already made peace with non-existence? Nothing. And that's when you realize Epicurus didn't just solve the problem of death, he discovered the secret to becoming untouchable while alive. The man who has truly accepted that death is nothing has already died to everything that isn't real. And everything that isn't real is what everyone else is afraid of losing. The practice of death mastery. Knowledge without application is philosophy. Application without knowledge is chaos. Death mastery requires both, and the courage to live as if you're already dead. Phase 1 ended with a promise. The man who has truly accepted that death is nothing becomes untouchable while alive. You've already died to everything that isn't real. But there's a canyon between understanding this intellectually and embodying it viscerally. You know that death is complete annihilation of consciousness. You grasp that the corpse feels nothing, so fearing death steals from the living. You've seen how Epicurus weaponized mortality into fearlessness. But knowing these truths and living them are different species of knowledge entirely. Remember what Phase 1 taught you. Most people live their entire existence negotiating with a corpse, making decisions based on what might happen when they're gone. You learned that this makes them governable by phantoms, enslaved to fear of things that will never be conscious enough to judge them. But reading about the invisible tribunal in your head is different from surgically removing it. Understanding that dead men don't vote is different from actually stopping your performance for phantom judges. Knowing that Steve Jobs focused on what brought him alive rather than his legacy is different from applying that same laser focus to your own choices. Most people read Phase 1 and nod along intellectually while their nervous system continues running the same fear-based programs. They grasp that death anxiety is irrational while still lying awake at 3 a.m. worrying about their legacy. They agree that posthumous judgment is meaningless while still making decisions based on what others might think. This is the gap between philosophical comprehension and visceral transformation. Phase 2 bridges that gap. The difference between someone who understands death mastery and someone who embodies it is simple. When facing actual pressure, public humiliation, career failure, relationship loss, physical danger, does their behavior change or doesn't it? Theory crumbles under real-world stress. Only internalized practice survives contact with genuine adversity. Phase 1 revealed that most people carry around an invisible tribunal in their head. Parents, society, God, future generations, all these phantom judges evaluating every decision. You learned that when you die, the tribunal dissolves, the judges disappear, the courtroom goes dark. But knowing this doesn't automatically silence the voices. Most people don't realize they're living for an invisible audience because that audience has become so embedded in their decision-making process it feels like their own voice. Remember how Phase 1 showed you that the average person performs for an audience that will never review their show? Now you're going to stop the performance by making the unconscious conscious, identifying exactly which phantom judges are running your life. Here's how to perform radical surgery on your mental tribunal. Step 1. The Decision Mapping Protocol. For the next week, document every significant decision you make, no matter how small. Not just career moves or relationship choices. Include what you wear, what you post on social media, how you respond in conversations, even what you order at restaurants. For each decision, ask, if I knew with absolute certainty that everyone who could judge this choice would be dead within 24 hours, would I choose differently? This isn't hypothetical philosophy. This is diagnostic precision. You're identifying which of your choices are authentically yours versus which are performances for dead men. Exactly what Phase 1 warned you about when it said you're sacrificing your present reality for nothing. Most people discover they're performing constantly. The executive who wears expensive suits not because he enjoys them but because they signal status to colleagues who won't remember him in 5 years. The woman who stays silent in meetings not because she has nothing to add, but because she's afraid of looking foolish to people whose opinions will be buried with them. Step 2. The Judge Inventory. When you catch yourself modifying behavior for phantom approval, identify the specific judge. Not society or people. Name them. Your father's voice criticizing your career choices. Your ex-partner's standards about relationships. Your high school peer's definition of success. Write down each judge and ask, when this person is dead and decomposing, will their opinion of my choice matter to anyone? The answer is always no. But your nervous system doesn't believe it yet. Step 3. The Mortality Dialogue. This is where most self-help stops, but death mastery goes surgical. You're going to have an explicit conversation with each phantom judge about their mortality. Visualize each judge clearly. Then speak to them directly. You're going to die. Your opinions will die with you. Your approval or disapproval will cease to exist when your brain stops functioning. Why am I living for someone who will be dust? This isn't meditation or visualization. It's reality therapy. You're forcing your unconscious mind to confront the literal fact that these judges are temporary biological machines, not eternal authorities. You're applying what Phase 1 taught you, that you cannot suffer what you cannot experience, and dead judges cannot experience your choices. The goal isn't to become callous toward people while they're alive. It's to stop being controlled by them after they're gone, and to stop being controlled by them now based on imaginary future judgment. Remember, you're becoming ungovernable, just as Phase 1 promised. The 5 levels of death-based decision-making. Once you've identified your phantom tribunal, you need a systematic method for making choices from a death-aware perspective. This isn't about becoming reckless, it's about becoming authentic. Level 1. The corpse test. Before any significant decision, ask, will my corpse care about this outcome? The answer trains your brain to distinguish between problems that matter to consciousness versus problems that only matter to ego. Level 2. The deathbed calculation. Imagine you're dying in exactly 1 year. How does this change your choice? This cuts through long-term planning paralysis and forces focus on what actually enriches conscious experience. Level 3. The legacy burn. Consider the choice that would most authentically express who you are, regardless of how you'll be remembered. This separates self-expression from reputation management. Level 4. The witness elimination. What would you choose if you knew no one would ever know you made this choice? This reveals how much of your decision-making is performance versus genuine preference. Level 5. The consciousness maximization. Which option increases the quality of your conscious experience while you're alive to have conscious experience? This is the Epicurean gold standard that Phase 1 introduced, optimizing for the only thing that actually matters, your temporary ability to experience pleasure, beauty, connection, and meaning. This is how you live with the intensity of someone who knows the clock is running, and the freedom of someone who knows that when it stops, there won't be anyone left to regret the ride. Most people never get past level 1. They understand intellectually that their corpse won't care, but they still choose based on posthumous concerns. Because they haven't practiced decision-making from higher levels. The advanced practitioner can run through all 5 levels in seconds and consistently choose based on consciousness maximization rather than phantom approval. Phase 1 showed you that once you truly grasp death as complete annihilation of consciousness, you become immune to threats that require you to be alive to suffer them. Religious manipulation becomes powerless. Death threats become laughable. Social shame about your legacy becomes irrelevant. But understanding that death is nothing transforms your relationship with social dynamics for a deeper reason. Most social anxiety stems from unconscious death terror. Fear of rejection, humiliation, exclusion. These trigger our deepest survival programming because, evolutionarily, social isolation meant death. But you're not a hunter-gatherer. Social rejection won't kill you. And even if it did, you've already made peace with non-existence. You've internalized what Phase 1 taught. The man who has genuinely accepted that death is nothing doesn't negotiate with phantoms. The embarrassment immunity training. Phase 1 taught you that posthumous judgment is meaningless. Phase 2 teaches you to embody this knowledge through systematic exposure to social discomfort. Start small, wear something slightly unconventional. Express an unpopular opinion in low-stakes conversation. Take up space in ways that feel mildly uncomfortable. As you do this, practice the death awareness mantra. Everyone witnessing this will be dead within 100 years. Their judgment will die with them. I am practicing being alive while I'm alive. The goal isn't to become antisocial or cruel. It's to separate authentic self-expression from compulsive approval-seeking. The reputation detachment exercise. Most people are enslaved by their reputation because they unconsciously believe it will outlive them. They think their good name is a form of immortality. But Phase 1 already showed you the truth. You're a temporary arrangement of atoms that will disperse back into the universe. Your reputation is even more temporary than your consciousness. Reputations die with the people who remember them. And most reputations die much faster than that. Practice this reality check. Research someone who was famous 200 years ago but isn't household knowledge today. Study how completely their reputation has faded. Then ask, if someone that significant can be forgotten, what makes me think my reputation will outlast my corpse? This isn't depressing, it's liberating. Once you realize reputation is temporary, you can focus on authentic relationships with actual living people rather than maintaining an image for imaginary eternal observers. The confrontation fearlessness method. Most people avoid necessary confrontations because they're unconsciously afraid that conflict might lead to social death. But someone who has genuinely accepted literal death doesn't negotiate with metaphorical death threats. When you need to have a difficult conversation, remind yourself, the worst possible outcome is that this person dislikes me. Eventually, we'll both be dead, and no one will remember this conflict. But right now, I'm alive, and I have something authentic to express. This creates a specific type of courage, not aggressive or dominating, but unshakable. You become someone who can speak truth without being attached to how it's received, because you're not performing for eternal judgment. You've achieved what Phase 1 promised. You've become ungovernable. Death mastery transforms how you think about work, relationships, and major life decisions because it eliminates false constraints and reveals what actually matters during your temporary existence. The Deathbed Career Audit. Remember what Phase 1 taught you about the executive who works 80-hour weeks, building something that will last. Last for whom? His corpse won't care about quarterly reports. Most people choose careers based on security, status, or parental approval. But your corpse won't spend the money you saved, won't feel proud of your job title, and won't care if you disappointed your parents. Perform this audit. If you knew you had exactly 10 years left to live, what work would you want to spend those years doing? Not what would make you the most money. Not what would impress people. Not what would be responsible. What would make the experience of being conscious during those 10 years most fulfilling? The death-aware person optimizes for conscious experience, not posthumous achievement. This doesn't mean becoming irresponsible. It means taking responsibility for the quality of your actual lived experience rather than your imaginary legacy. You're applying Phase 1's core insight. When you stop living for imaginary futures, you start living for actual present moments. The relationship death test. Many people stay in relationships that drain them because they're afraid of being alone, afraid of what others will think, or afraid they won't find someone else before they die. But here's what Death Mastery reveals. A bad relationship is worse than death because death ends suffering while bad relationships extend it. And since you're going to die anyway, spending your limited conscious time with someone who diminishes your experience is the only real tragedy. This isn't nihilism, it's what Phase 1 called the purest form of life affirmation possible. Apply the mortality lens. I have perhaps 30 to 50 years of consciousness left. Do I want to spend them with this person? Not because I should, not because it's safe, not because I'm afraid of the alternative, but because this relationship enriches my experience of being alive. This isn't callousness, it's the deepest form of respect for both your life and theirs. People deserve to be chosen enthusiastically, not endured out of fear. Even after understanding death mastery intellectually and practicing the basic exercises, most people encounter specific forms of resistance. These resistances are actually evolutionary survival programs trying to keep you alive in a world that no longer threatens your survival. The responsibility trap. Many people resist death mastery because they believe it means becoming irresponsible toward others. If nothing matters after I'm dead, why should I care about my children's future? This misses the point entirely. Death mastery doesn't eliminate care, it purifies it. When you stop trying to control outcomes beyond your death, you can focus completely on enriching conscious experience while you and your loved ones are alive to have conscious experience. The death-aware parent doesn't try to secure their child's entire future, impossible. They focus on providing love, wisdom, and resources during the time they're actually alive to provide them. They teach their children to think for themselves rather than living for parental approval that will die with the parent. The meaning crisis override. Some people resist accepting death as nothing because they believe it makes life meaningless. But Phase 1 already addressed this confusion. When you stop seeking cosmic significance, local significance becomes everything. The conversation with a friend matters because you're both conscious right now. The sunset is beautiful because you can see it today. Love is precious because it exists in the present moment between two temporary beings. Meaning doesn't come from permanence, it comes from consciousness. The sunset is meaningful because you can experience its beauty, not because it lasts forever. Love is meaningful because you can feel it, not because it transcends death. When you stop seeking cosmic significance, local significance becomes infinite. Every moment of genuine connection, every experience of beauty, every act of kindness matters precisely because it's temporary. The control addiction. The deepest resistance to death mastery comes from the illusion that anxiety and fear somehow give you control over outcomes. People unconsciously believe that worrying about death will help them avoid it, or that living for posthumous judgment will somehow extend their influence beyond the grave. But anxiety doesn't prevent death, it just makes life worse while you're living it. And posthumous judgment doesn't extend your agency, it just prevents you from exercising your agency while you're alive to exercise it. The override is simple but requires practice. Every time you catch yourself trying to control outcomes beyond your death, Redirect that energy toward optimizing outcomes during your life. Maintaining death mastery under extreme pressure. Theory collapses under real pressure. The true test of death mastery isn't how you feel while reading philosophy, it's how you behave when facing genuine adversity. The crisis protocol. When facing major life crises, job loss, relationship ending, health problems, financial stress, your nervous system will try to revert to fear-based decision-making. This is normal. The key is having a systematic protocol for returning to death-aware clarity. First, acknowledge the biological reality. My nervous system is in survival mode because it's programmed to keep me alive. But I've already accepted that survival is temporary. Let me respond from that clarity rather than from primitive fear. Second, apply the mortality perspective. In 100 years, everyone involved in this crisis will be dead. This problem will be completely forgotten. How does that change my response? Third, optimize for conscious experience. Given that this is happening and I can't control the outcome, how can I move through this crisis in a way that maintains my dignity and authentic self-expression? This isn't about suppressing emotions or pretending problems don't matter. It's about maintaining perspective that allows you to respond skillfully rather than reactively. The persecution test. The ultimate test of death mastery is how you respond when others actively try to harm you. Through gossip, professional sabotage, social exclusion, or direct attacks on your reputation. The average person becomes consumed with defending themselves, proving their innocence, or getting revenge. But someone who has genuinely accepted death as nothing recognizes these attacks for what they are. Temporary disturbances in the opinions of temporary beings. The death mastery response. This person is trying to harm my reputation. But reputations are temporary, and so are the people who hold them. Their attack cannot actually diminish my conscious experience unless I allow it to. I'll respond practically if necessary, but I won't be emotionally enslaved by the need to control how temporary beings think about me. This creates an unshakable quality that's often mistaken for indifference but is actually the deepest form of life engagement possible. The ability to participate fully in existence without being controlled by outcomes you can't control. You've achieved what Phase 1 promised. You've become untouchable while alive. Phase 2 ends where real life begins. You now have systematic techniques for identifying phantom judges, making death-aware decisions, and maintaining perspective under pressure. You've learned to apply what Phase 1 taught you, that the man who has made peace with non-existence has already died to everything that isn't real. But knowledge without consistent application remains philosophy. The integration challenge is simple. Can you live as if you're already dead to everything that isn't real, while being fully alive to everything that is? This means choosing authenticity over approval, conscious experience over posthumous achievement, and genuine connection over reputation management. Not occasionally when you remember to, but as your default mode of being. The person who masters Phase 2 doesn't think about death philosophy during crises. They've internalized it so completely that their behavior automatically flows from death-aware clarity. They've trained themselves to be ungovernable by phantoms and untouchable by threats that require them to be alive to suffer. They've achieved everything Phase 1 promised, complete freedom from the fear that enslaves everyone else. But even this level of mastery is just preparation. Because once you've learned to live as if you're already dead to everything false, you're ready for the most radical realization of all, what it means to be truly alive to everything real. Phase 1 taught you that death is nothing. Phase 2 taught you to live from that truth. But there's one more transformation waiting, one that most people who understand death mastery never discover, because they think becoming ungovernable is the end of the journey. It's not. It's the beginning. The man who has died to all illusions discovers he was never more alive. When you stop performing for phantoms, reality becomes so vivid it's almost unbearable, and completely irresistible. Phase 2 ended with a promise. Once you've learned to live as if you're already dead to everything false, you're ready for the most radical realization of all, what it means to be truly alive to everything real. You've completed the prerequisites. You know that death is complete annihilation of consciousness. You've systematically identified and dismantled your phantom tribunal. You've learned to make decisions from death-aware clarity rather than fear-based conditioning. You can maintain perspective under extreme pressure, and remain ungovernable by threats that require you to be alive to suffer. But if you're honest, something unexpected has been happening as you've practiced these skills. Moments where reality becomes almost overwhelmingly vivid. Conversations that feel more real than anything you've experienced. Creative impulses that emerge from some deeper source than ego. Glimpses of what existence might be like when you stop defending against it. These aren't side effects of death mastery, they're the point. The great paradox of accepting mortality is that it doesn't make you less alive, it makes you more alive than you ever imagined possible. When you stop negotiating with phantoms, you become capable of engaging with reality so directly that most people can't even recognize what you're doing. This is phase 3, learning to live from the space that opens up when you've died to everything that isn't real. Phase 1 taught you that death is nothing. Phase 2 taught you to live from that truth. But neither phase prepared you for what happens when this knowledge becomes so integrated that you stop filtering experience through survival anxiety entirely. Most people live in a state of chronic experiential dampening. Fear of death creates fear of life, because to be fully alive means being fully vulnerable to loss. So they unconsciously dial down their sensitivity to beauty, connection, meaning, and joy. Better to experience less than risk the pain of losing what they love. But someone who has genuinely made peace with losing everything, including their own consciousness, can afford to experience everything with complete intensity. When you're no longer protecting yourself from loss, you can afford to love completely, create fearlessly, and engage with existence at full amplitude. This isn't about positive thinking or emotional manipulation. This is about the literal neurological fact that when your nervous system stops running constant background programs of threat assessment and phantom performance, enormous amounts of energy become available for actual experience. The presence protocols. Most meditation and mindfulness teachings tell you to be present, but they don't explain what prevents presence in the first place. Death mastery reveals the answer. You can't be fully present while part of your consciousness is performing for judges who don't exist. The Death Master's approach to presence is surgical. Instead of trying to focus on the present moment, you eliminate what's preventing presence from occurring naturally. The phantom audience scan. Before any experience you want to engage fully, a conversation, creative work, physical activity, even eating a meal, quickly scan for phantom audience members. Are you unconsciously performing this experience for imaginary observers? Are you evaluating how it will look from the outside rather than experiencing it from the inside? When you catch phantom performance, apply the mortality reset. Everyone I'm performing for will be dead within 100 years. Their judgment will die with them. Let me experience this directly. The death-aware sensory opening. Most people unconsciously constrict their sensory experience because fuller perception feels too vulnerable. But vulnerability to what? To experiences that will end when you die anyway. Practice deliberately opening your senses with this knowledge. I'm going to die, so this moment of seeing/hearing/feeling is precious precisely because it's temporary. Let me experience it completely while I'm alive to experience it. The results are often startling. Colors become more vivid. Music becomes more emotionally affecting. Physical sensations become more pleasurable. Not because you're manipulating your neurology, but because you're removing the unconscious dampening that fear creates. Phase 2 taught you to apply the death test to relationships, staying only with people who enrich your conscious experience. But Phase 3 reveals something deeper. When two people who have both accepted mortality interact authentically, entirely new forms of connection become possible. Most relationships are unconscious contracts for mutual ego maintenance. People perform versions of themselves designed to secure approval, avoid abandonment, or maintain control. But these performances create intimacy barriers. You can only be as close as your most defended parts allow. When someone has truly accepted that both they and everyone they love will die, these defensive barriers become pointless. Why perform for someone who will be dead within decades? Why protect yourself from loss when loss is guaranteed? Why manipulate for security when security is an illusion? True intimacy requires what most people find terrifying, allowing someone to see you without your survival strategies. But death mastery makes this natural, because you've already accepted the ultimate vulnerability. The temporal honesty practice. In significant relationships, practice speaking from the perspective of your shared mortality. Not morbidly, but matter-of-factly. We're both going to die, probably within the next 50 years. Given that our time together is limited and precious, here's what I'm actually thinking/feeling/wanting right now. This eliminates most relationship games immediately. When both people are aware that their time together is finite, pretense becomes ridiculous and authenticity becomes urgent. The legacy-free love method. Most people love conditionally. They love others for what those others do for them, provide for them, or make them appear to others. But these are all ego transactions that die with the ego. Practice loving people for what can only be experienced in the present moment. Their consciousness, their unique way of experiencing reality, their particular aliveness. This creates a quality of love that's simultaneously more intense and more free, because it's not based on getting anything that could be lost. The deepest intimacy becomes possible when two people can discuss their shared mortality directly, not as a philosophical exercise, but as the fundamental context for their relationship. This isn't about dwelling on death or becoming morbid. It's about acknowledging the temporal nature of your connection and choosing to love each other fully within that context. We don't know how much time we have together. We might have decades, or one of us might die next year. Given that uncertainty, how do we want to love each other while we're both alive to experience love? When relationships are grounded in shared mortality awareness, they become simultaneously more precious and more free. More precious because time together is recognized as finite. More free because there's nothing to protect that won't be lost anyway. Phase 2 taught you to burn your legacy concerns and stop creating for posthumous judgment. But Phase 3 reveals what emerges when you create from pure aliveness rather than ego-driven immortality seeking. Most creative work is unconsciously motivated by the desire to outlast death, to create something that will keep your memory alive after your consciousness ends. But this motivation creates several problems. It makes you second-guess authentic creative impulses in favor of what might be important. It creates performance anxiety around the work, and it disconnects you from the joy of creating itself. The Death Master creates from an entirely different source, the overflow of being fully alive. When you've accepted that both you and your work will eventually be forgotten, creation becomes pure self-expression rather than immortality seeking. This doesn't make the work less significant, it makes it more authentic. The temporal creativity audit. Before starting any creative project, ask, am I creating this because I want to outlast death, or because I'm alive right now and this wants to be expressed through me? If the honest answer is immortality seeking, the project will likely be ego-driven and inauthentic. If the answer is present moment aliveness, the project becomes an expression of your temporary consciousness, which paradoxically often produces more lasting work than explicit legacy building. The anonymous creation practice. Regularly create things with no intention of anyone else ever seeing them. Write stories you'll never publish. Make music you'll never perform. Paint pictures you'll never show. This trains you to separate the joy of creation from the ego satisfaction of recognition. The Death Master who creates from pure aliveness often has more impact than someone desperately trying to build a legacy. Why? Because authentic expression resonates more deeply than calculated performance. People can sense the difference between someone creating to be remembered and someone creating because they're alive. This creates what appears to be a paradox. The less you try to impact the future, the more likely you are to actually impact it. But this isn't really paradoxical. It's the natural result of authenticity being more compelling than performance. The key is maintaining what Phase 1 called the freedom of someone who knows that when it stops, there won't be anyone left to regret the ride. Create fully, share freely, but remain unattached to outcomes beyond your death. The is how to know you're facing actual death? Everything in Phases 1 and 2 was preparation for this moment. How someone who has mastered death philosophy responds when facing actual death, their own or someone they love. This is where theory meets the ultimate reality check. It's easy to say you've accepted mortality when death feels distant. But when you're diagnosed with terminal illness, or when someone you love is dying, does your hard-won death mastery actually provide the clarity and peace it promised? The death master facing their own terminal diagnosis has several advantages over someone who has spent their life avoiding mortality awareness. They've already grieved their own non-existence, so the news doesn't come as an existential shock. They've practiced seeing their life from the perspective of its ending, so they have clarity about what actually matters during their remaining time. They've learned to separate conscious experience from ego concerns, so they can focus on the quality of their remaining moments rather than raging against the unfairness of mortality. The Terminal Diagnosis Protocol. If you receive news that your death is imminent, apply the Death Mastery Framework systematically. Perspective. This is what I've been preparing for my entire adult life. Death was always coming. Now I know approximately when. Clarity. Given my limited remaining time, what experiences do I want to prioritize? What relationships do I want to deepen? What do I want to create or complete? Freedom. I no longer need to manage my reputation or plan for a future I won't see. I can be completely authentic for whatever time remains. This isn't about suppressing fear or grief. Those are natural responses that should be honored. It's about maintaining the perspective that allows you to live your final months or years as fully as possible. When someone you love is dying, the death master watching a loved one die faces a different challenge, maintaining death-aware clarity while experiencing the full intensity of love and loss. The temptation is to fall into the same denial and bargaining that characterizes how most people approach mortality. But death mastery offers a different path, loving someone completely while simultaneously accepting that losing them is inevitable. The conscious grief process. When someone you love is dying, practice holding two truths simultaneously. This loss will cause me intense pain, and that pain is appropriate and healthy. This person was always going to die, and our time together was always temporary and precious. This creates what might seem like a contradiction, grieving fully while accepting completely. But it's not contradictory. It's the deepest form of love possible, treasuring someone precisely because they're temporary. The death master doesn't try to avoid the pain of loss. They experience it as the natural consequence of having loved someone who was mortal. But they don't add unnecessary suffering by raging against the fundamental nature of existence. Phase 3's final revelation is that death mastery isn't just about personal liberation. It's about becoming capable of engaging with the world's problems from a place of complete fearlessness. Most social and political problems exist because people are governed by death anxiety. They hoard resources out of survival fear. They create in-groups and out-groups based on tribal survival programming. They avoid necessary confrontations because conflict feels like a threat to their existence. But someone who has genuinely made peace with mortality can engage with collective problems from an entirely different foundation. They're not trying to secure their own survival, so they can focus completely on what actually serves conscious beings while they're alive to be served. The Fearless Leadership Protocol. The Death Master leader has several qualities that are rare in conventional leadership. They can make unpopular decisions because they're not trying to secure their reputation for posterity. They can take necessary risks because they've already accepted the worst possible outcome. They can speak truth to power because they're not trying to protect their position indefinitely. Most importantly, they can focus on what actually improves conscious experience for living beings rather than what looks good to imaginary eternal observers. The mortality-based decision framework for leaders. Before making any significant decision that affects others, ask, how does this choice impact the quality of conscious experience for people who are alive right now? Am I avoiding this decision because I'm afraid of how I'll be remembered? What would I choose if I knew I'd be dead in 1 year and couldn't see the long-term consequences? This doesn't mean ignoring future consequences. It means not being paralyzed by trying to control outcomes beyond your lifetime. Death mastery creates a specific type of social courage that's desperately needed. The ability to address collective problems without being derailed by personal survival concerns. The Death Master can advocate for necessary changes without worrying about their career. They can speak uncomfortable truths without being attached to how they're received. They can take positions that might be unpopular because they're not trying to secure approval from people who will be dead within decades. This isn't about becoming reckless or ignoring practical consequences. It's about separating skillful action from ego protection, so you can respond to what the situation actually requires rather than what feels safe for your image. Phase 3 culminates in a way of being that most people never imagine possible. Simultaneously completely at peace with dying and completely engaged with living. This isn't the detached serenity often associated with spiritual attainment. It's more like what athletes describe as being in the zone, total absorption in what's happening right now, without mental commentary or self-protection. Except instead of lasting for a game or performance, it becomes your default mode of existence. This are the daily practice of transcendent engagement. Morning mortality reminder. Each day, briefly acknowledge, I'm going to die, everyone I know is going to die, and this day is a temporary gift of consciousness. How do I want to experience it? Evening authenticity review. Each night, ask, did I live today as someone who has accepted mortality, or did I slip back into performing for phantom judges? Crisis response protocol. When facing any significant challenge, immediately apply the death mastery framework. Everyone involved in this situation will be dead within 100 years. Given that context, what response serves conscious experience rather than ego protection? The central paradox of death mastery resolves in phase 3. Accepting that life is temporary doesn't make you care less about it. It makes you capable of caring more deeply than someone who's trying to protect themselves from loss. When you're no longer defending against the inevitable, you can afford to love completely, create fearlessly, and engage with existence at full intensity. You've achieved what the entire program promised. You've become untouchable by threats that require you to be alive to suffer them, while becoming completely available to experiences that require you to be alive to enjoy them. You've learned to live as someone who has already died to everything false, and is therefore capable of being fully present to everything real. You've mastered the ultimate skill, being simultaneously at peace with ending and in love with existing. This is death mastery. Not the ability to avoid death, but the ability to be so alive that death becomes irrelevant to how you experience life. You've stopped performing for phantoms and started participating fully in the temporary miracle of conscious existence. The person who completes phase 3 doesn't think about death mastery during their daily life. They've integrated it so completely that their behavior flows naturally from death-aware aliveness. They've achieved the deepest form of fearlessness possible, not because they're invulnerable, but because they've accepted vulnerability so completely that it no longer controls them. They've solved the fundamental human problem. How to be fully alive while knowing you're going to die. And in solving it, they've discovered that the solution was never about conquering death. It was about using the knowledge of death to become more alive than they ever imagined possible. This is the end of the program, but the beginning of everything else. The individual who masters death discovers they were never just an individual. When you stop defending your temporary existence, you become capable of serving existence itself. Phase 3 ended with a profound realization. Accepting mortality completely doesn't diminish your engagement with life. It enables a transcendent aliveness that transforms everything you touch. You learn to live as someone who has died to all illusions and is therefore fully present to reality. You discovered the paradox that caring less about outcomes makes you capable of caring more deeply about experience. But if you've integrated phase 3 completely, something unexpected has been emerging. You've started noticing how your death mastery affects not just your own experience, but the experience of everyone around you. People respond to you differently. Conversations go deeper without effort. Your presence seems to give others permission to be more authentic. This isn't coincidence or wishful thinking. This is the natural result of someone who has stopped performing for phantoms, encountering a world full of people still enslaved by imaginary audiences. Phase 4 explores the most advanced dimension of death mastery. How your individual liberation becomes a force for collective transformation. When you've truly accepted that everyone, including yourself, will be dead within 100 years, you become capable of engaging with human civilization from an entirely different foundation. You stop trying to secure your place in history and start serving the quality of conscious experience while consciousness exists. You stop competing for resources that your corpse won't need and start collaborating to optimize the brief miracle of awareness itself. You stop defending your temporary identity and start participating in something much larger, the conscious universe examining itself through temporary arrangements of matter. This is Phase 4, learning to be a death master in a world of mortals who don't yet know they're mortal. How death mastery spreads. The first thing you'll notice as you embody Phase 3 completely is that your death mastery affects others without any conscious effort on your part. People sense something different about you, a quality of presence that's simultaneously more intense and more peaceful than what they're used to. This happens because most people are unconsciously performing for phantom audiences, and when they encounter someone who isn't performing at all, it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. They can feel the difference between authentic presence and social performance, even if they can't articulate what that difference is. When you've stopped seeking approval from judges who will be dead within decades, you inadvertently give others permission to stop performing too. Your authenticity creates what might be called a permission field around you, a social space where people feel safer being genuine. This isn't something you do deliberately. It's the natural result of not having an unconscious agenda to manage how others perceive you. When you're not trying to impress people, they stop feeling the need to impress you. When you're not judging them based on their performance, they start relaxing their performance. The authentic presence protocol. In any social situation, practice being completely present without any agenda to create a particular impression. Don't try to be likable, impressive, or even helpful. Simply be available to what's actually happening between you and the other person. Most people will initially feel disoriented by this. They're used to social interactions being mutual performance agreements. But as they adjust to your non-performance, they'll often begin sharing things they normally keep hidden, speaking more directly than usual, or asking deeper questions than they typically risk. In a world where most people live in constant anxiety about imaginary futures and phantom judgments, someone who is genuinely present to reality becomes an anchor point for others. Your death-aware presence reminds people, usually unconsciously, that they're alive right now, that this moment is real, and that the various mental stories they're telling themselves are just stories. This creates what therapists call a co-regulation effect. When someone who is genuinely calm and present spends time with someone who is anxious and scattered, the anxious person's nervous system often synchronizes with the calm person's state. For the death master, this happens because you're not carrying the unconscious tension that comes from trying to control outcomes beyond your death. Your nervous system isn't running background programs of phantom threat assessment, so you can be completely available to what's actually happening right now. Let's dive into how the death master among mortals. Phase 3 taught you how two death masters can love each other from a place of shared mortality awareness. But Phase 4 addresses a more common situation: how to love and connect with people who haven't yet accepted their mortality. This creates unique challenges and opportunities. You can see clearly what's driving their behavior: fear of death, need for approval from phantom judges, attachment to outcomes they can't control. But you can't force them to see what you see. You can only love them skillfully while they're still caught in patterns you've transcended. When someone you care about is suffering from death anxiety, worrying about their legacy, seeking approval from people who don't matter, trying to control outcomes beyond their death, the death master's response is neither dismissive nor enabling. You don't try to convince them that their concerns are meaningless. This rarely works and often creates resistance. Instead, you offer an alternative way of being through your own presence and example. The skillful response framework. Acknowledge their experience. I can see this is causing you real distress. Avoid rescuing them from necessary discomfort. Don't try to solve problems that are actually teaching them about the futility of phantom control. Model death-aware responses. When facing similar situations, demonstrate how someone who has accepted mortality might respond. Create space for their own discovery. Ask questions that might help them notice the assumptions underlying their anxiety. One of the most complex applications of Phase 4 principles is parenting from a place of death mastery. You want to prepare your children for life while also helping them develop a healthy relationship with mortality, without traumatizing them or creating premature morbidity. The mortality-conscious parenting approach. Age-appropriate death education. Instead of protecting children from all awareness of mortality, gradually introduce the concept that all living things, including people, have temporary existence. This can actually reduce death anxiety by making mortality a normal part of life rather than a terrifying secret. Teaching authentic self-expression. Since you're not trying to create a child who will make you look good to phantom judges, you can focus on helping them discover and express their authentic nature rather than training them to perform for approval. Modeling present moment engagement. Children naturally live in the present until they're trained out of it by adults who are anxious about imaginary futures. The Death Master parent can preserve this natural present moment awareness rather than unconsciously undermining it. Preparing for independence. Since you know your influence will end when you die, you focus on giving your children the tools they need to think for themselves rather than training them to need your approval indefinitely. Phase 4 reveals how death mastery transforms your approach to career, business, and professional relationships. When you're not trying to build monuments to your own ego or desperately seeking security for a future you won't be conscious to experience, work becomes something entirely different. The Death Master works not to secure their reputation or build their legacy, but to contribute to conscious experience while consciousness exists. This shift from ego-driven achievement to service-based contribution often produces better results than traditional career strategies. Project selection. Choose work based on, does this contribute to the quality of conscious experience for people who are alive right now? Rather than, will this make me look important or secure my future? Collaboration style. Since you're not trying to claim credit that will outlast your death, you can collaborate more freely, share ideas without possessiveness, and focus on collective results rather than individual recognition. Risk assessment. Professional risks become easier to evaluate when you're not trying to protect a reputation that will die with you. You can take necessary risks that serve the work without being paralyzed by how failure might affect your image. Leadership approach. Death Master leaders focus on developing others' capabilities rather than maintaining their own indispensability, since they know their influence will end anyway. If you run a business or organization, Death Mastery creates a completely different relationship with success and failure. You can pursue excellence and growth without being emotionally enslaved by outcomes you can't ultimately control. This often paradoxically leads to better business results, because you can make decisions based on what actually serves customers and employees rather than what protects your ego or manages your reputation. The Mortality Conscious Business Framework. Build systems that don't depend on your permanent presence. Hire people who are better than you at specific functions rather than people who make you feel important. Make decisions based on what serves the actual mission rather than what makes you look good. Plan for succession from the beginning, since your involvement will inevitably end. Let's take a look at the Death Master as citizen. Perhaps the most radical application of Phase 4 principles is how Death Mastery transforms your relationship with social and political issues. When you've accepted that everyone involved in current political conflicts will be dead within 100 years, you can engage with collective problems from a completely different foundation. Most political engagement is unconsciously driven by tribal survival instincts, us versus them thinking that treats political disagreement as existential threat. But someone who has genuinely accepted mortality can engage with political issues without being triggered into survival mode. This doesn't make you politically indifferent. It makes you capable of caring about actual policy outcomes rather than symbolic victories for your tribe. You can support positions that improve conscious experience for living beings without needing those positions to validate your identity or secure your group's dominance. Issue evaluation. Ask, how does this policy affect the quality of conscious experience for people who are alive right now? Rather than, does supporting this position make me look good to my political tribe? Opposition engagement. Since everyone you disagree with will be dead within decades, you can engage with political opponents as fellow temporary beings rather than existential enemies. This often leads to more productive dialogue and better solutions. Long-term thinking. Paradoxically, accepting that you won't see long-term outcomes often leads to better long-term thinking, because you're not trying to engineer outcomes that will vindicate your personal beliefs. The Death Master activist is motivated not by the need to be on the right side of history, since they won't be conscious to experience history's judgment, but by the desire to reduce unnecessary suffering while conscious beings exist to suffer. This creates a specific type of activism that's simultaneously more compassionate and more effective than ego-driven political engagement. You can advocate for necessary changes without being attached to personal credit, work with unlikely allies when it serves the cause, and maintain perspective during both victories and defeats. This is how death masters relationship with knowledge and truth. Phase 4 explores how accepting mortality transforms your relationship with learning, teaching, and truth-seeking. When you're not trying to be right for posterity, you can engage with knowledge more honestly and effectively. Most people's relationship with learning is unconsciously compromised by ego concerns. They avoid subjects that might make them feel ignorant, resist changing their minds about beliefs that define their identity, and seek information that confirms what they already think rather than information that challenges them to grow. But when you've accepted that both you and your beliefs will die, learning becomes pure exploration rather than identity protection. The death-aware learning framework. Actively seek information that challenges your current understanding. Change your mind freely when evidence warrants it, since your reputation for consistency will die with you. Ask questions that might make you look ignorant, since everyone who might judge your ignorance will be dead within decades. Study subjects for the joy of understanding, rather than for social status or professional advantage. When you teach or share knowledge from a place of death mastery, the ego dynamics that usually compromise education disappear. You're not trying to impress students with your brilliance, maintain authority through information hoarding, or create disciples who will preserve your intellectual legacy. Instead, you can focus completely on helping others understand, even if that means admitting the limits of your own knowledge or teaching them to think independently rather than depend on your guidance. The Death Master Teaching Approach. Share knowledge freely without concern for intellectual property or credit. Encourage students to surpass you rather than trying to maintain your superior position. Admit ignorance honestly when you don't know something. Focus on developing students' thinking abilities rather than their loyalty to your ideas. Let's dive into death mastery as a cultural force. As more individuals integrate death mastery, the cumulative effect begins to transform the cultural atmosphere itself. A society where even a small percentage of people have genuinely accepted mortality becomes fundamentally different from one where everyone is unconsciously enslaved by death anxiety. Just as individual death masters create permission fields that allow others to be more authentic, a critical mass of death masters in a culture creates collective permission for honesty, creativity, and genuine connection. When enough people stop performing for phantom judges, the entire social atmosphere becomes less performative. When enough people stop being controlled by reputation management, authentic expression becomes more socially acceptable. When enough people stop trying to control outcomes beyond their death, collective decision-making becomes more rational and less fear-driven. The innovation acceleration principle. Cultures with higher death mastery tend to innovate more rapidly and effectively, because innovation requires the willingness to fail, to be wrong, to have your current understanding superseded by something better. Fear of looking foolish or having your ideas proven inadequate slows down the trial and error process that drives progress. But when people have genuinely accepted that both they and their ideas are temporary, they can engage in the creative destruction that innovation requires without it feeling like ego death. Phase 4's final paradox is that those who completely abandon concern for their personal legacy often create the most lasting positive impact. When you stop trying to be remembered and start serving conscious experience itself, your contributions tend to outlast those of people desperately trying to secure their place in history. The Death Master's influence often spreads through channels they never see or track. Someone who has stopped performing for phantom judges gives others permission to be authentic. Someone who has accepted mortality helps others live more fully. Someone who has transcended ego concerns creates space for genuine connection and collaboration. These effects ripple outward in ways that can't be measured or credited to the original source. But that's precisely why they're effective. They're not contaminated by the ego concerns that usually compromise attempts at influence. The ultimate irony of death mastery is that those who most completely accept their temporary existence often create the most enduring contributions to human flourishing. Not because they're trying to outlast death, but because their acceptance of mortality allows them to serve life more effectively while they're alive to serve it. They become what the ancient Greeks called eudaimonic, people whose lives serve human flourishing not as a strategy for immortality, but as a natural expression of having made peace with mortality. Phase 4 culminates in a way of being that transcends individual identity without losing personal authenticity. You maintain your unique perspective and capabilities while simultaneously serving something larger than your temporary existence. This isn't about losing yourself in a collective or abandoning individual agency. It's about recognizing that your individual consciousness is part of a larger phenomenon, the universe examining itself through temporary arrangements of matter, and aligning your actions with that recognition. The daily practice of collective service. Morning collective awareness. Each day, briefly acknowledge, I am temporary consciousness serving the ongoing project of consciousness itself. How can my unique capabilities contribute today? Evening impact reflection. Each night, ask, did my actions today serve the quality of conscious experience for others, or was I unconsciously serving my ego concerns? Crisis response protocol. When facing any significant challenge, ask, how does this situation look from the perspective of consciousness itself, rather than from the perspective of my temporary identity? The Death Master's ultimate freedom. The person who completes Phase 4 has achieved the ultimate freedom. They've become so unattached to their personal survival that they can serve existence itself without reservation. They've stopped defending their temporary identity and started participating in the ongoing project of consciousness exploring and improving itself. They've resolved the deepest human contradictions: how to care deeply while accepting impermanence, how to act decisively while acknowledging uncertainty, how to maintain individual authenticity while serving collective flourishing. This is the Death Master's world, a reality where accepting mortality completely allows you to serve life more fully than those still trying to escape death. Where dying to your ego allows you to participate in something immortal. Not your personal consciousness, but consciousness itself. You've learned to live as both an individual and as an expression of the universe's capacity for awareness. You've mastered not just your own mortality, but your relationship to the mortality of everything you touch. You've become capable of loving the temporary nature of existence so completely that your love serves existence itself. This is the final stage of death mastery. Becoming someone whose individual liberation serves collective awakening, whose personal peace with mortality helps others live more fully, whose acceptance of impermanence contributes to something that transcends any individual life. You've stopped trying to outlast death and started serving the ongoing miracle of consciousness while consciousness exists to be served. You've achieved the deepest victory possible, not over death, but through acceptance of death into full participation in life. You came seeking to master death. You discovered that death masters you into life. You began this journey believing death was your enemy. You end it knowing death was your greatest teacher. Phase 1 shattered your illusions about mortality, revealing that death is complete annihilation of consciousness, that posthumous concerns are phantom fears, and that the corpse feels nothing. You learned that most people live their entire existence negotiating with a ghost, enslaved by judgments that will die with the judges. Phase 2 gave you the surgical tools to dismantle your phantom tribunal, identifying the invisible audience that controlled your decisions, learning to make choices from death-aware clarity, and developing systematic methods for maintaining perspective under pressure. You practiced becoming ungovernable by threats that require you to be alive to suffer. Phase 3 revealed the great paradox, that accepting mortality completely doesn't diminish your aliveness but enables transcendent intensity of experience. You discovered that when you stop defending against loss, you can afford to love completely, create fearlessly, and engage with existence at full amplitude. Phase 4 showed you that individual death mastery becomes a force for collective transformation, that your personal liberation from death anxiety creates permission fields for others' authenticity, and that serving conscious experience while consciousness exists transcends any personal legacy. Now you understand what Epicurus knew. You cannot suffer what you cannot experience. And what he didn't yet see, you cannot truly live until you've made peace with not living. 1. The Phantom Liberation Principle. Every fear that controls you is ultimately death anxiety in disguise. Social rejection, financial ruin, professional failure, physical pain, these only have power over you because your survival programming treats them as threats to existence. But you've already accepted non-existence. Therefore, nothing can threaten you that requires you to be alive to suffer it. 2. The Consciousness Maximization Standard. Since you are temporary consciousness, The only rational life strategy is optimizing for the quality of conscious experience while you exist to have conscious experience. Not posthumous achievement. Not cosmic significance. Not permanent security. Present moment aliveness. 3. The authenticity imperative. When you stop performing for judges who will be dead within decades, authentic self-expression becomes inevitable. You've removed the primary barrier to being genuine, the fear that someone might disapprove of who you really are. But their disapproval dies with them, while your authenticity enriches your actual existence. 4. The service transcendence. Individual liberation from death anxiety naturally becomes service to consciousness itself. When you're no longer defending your temporary identity, you become capable of participating in something larger, the ongoing project of the universe examining itself through temporary arrangements of matter. 5. The ultimate freedom recognition. The deepest freedom isn't the ability to do whatever you want, it's the ability to want what serves your actual existence rather than what serves your ego's immortality fantasies. Death mastery doesn't give you more choices, it reveals which choices actually matter. You now live from a fundamentally different foundation than those still enslaved by death anxiety. Decision-making. Every choice flows through the 5 levels of death-based decision-making, from the corpse test to consciousness maximization. You automatically prioritize what enriches actual experience over what manages phantom reputation. Relationships. You love people for their temporary consciousness rather than what they can provide for your ego. You choose relationships that enrich present moment experience rather than ones that feel safe or socially appropriate. Work and creation. You contribute to conscious experience while consciousness exists rather than building monuments to your own ego. Your creative work expresses authentic aliveness rather than calculated attempts at immortality. Social engagement. You participate in collective problem-solving from a place of complete fearlessness, not because you're invulnerable, but because you've accepted vulnerability so completely that it no longer controls you. Crisis response. When facing adversity, you automatically apply the mortality perspective. Everyone involved will be dead within 100 years. This problem will be completely forgotten. How do I respond from death-aware clarity rather than phantom fear? Without trying, you now emanate what others unconsciously hunger for, someone who has stopped performing for imaginary audiences. Your presence gives others permission to be authentic because you're not seeking anything from them that your corpse could benefit from. People feel something different around you, a quality of attention that's simultaneously more intense and more peaceful than what they're used to. This happens because you're not carrying the unconscious tension that comes from trying to control outcomes beyond your death. You've become a reality anchor in a world of people lost in phantom concerns, someone whose death-aware presence reminds others that they're alive right now, that this moment is real, and that most of their mental suffering comes from stories about imaginary futures. These are the practices that maintain mastery. Death mastery isn't a destination, it's a way of being that requires consistent practice. Daily mortality awareness. Each morning, briefly acknowledge, I'm going to die, everyone I know is going to die, and this day is a temporary gift of consciousness. How do I want to experience it? Evening authenticity review. Each night, ask, did I live today as someone who has accepted mortality, or did I slip back into performing for phantom judges? Crisis protocol. When facing any significant challenge, immediately apply the death mastery framework. Everyone involved in this situation will be dead within 100 years. Given that context, what response serves conscious experience rather than ego protection? Phantom audience scans. Before important interactions, quickly check, am I about to perform for imaginary observers, or can I be present to what's actually happening? The deathbed test. For major decisions, ask, if I were dying in 1 year, would this choice serve my actual experience or just my reputation management? You've achieved something most people never imagine possible. You've become simultaneously at peace with dying and completely engaged with living. You've solved the fundamental human problem, how to be fully alive while knowing you're going to die. This creates a specific type of fearlessness that the world desperately needs. Not reckless indifference, but calm clarity about what actually matters during temporary existence. You can now speak necessary truths without being attached to how they're received. Love completely without trying to control outcomes you can't control. Create authentically without needing eternal validation. Take meaningful risks without being paralyzed by phantom consequences. Engage with conflict without treating disagreement as existential threat. Face uncertainty without needing guarantees about imaginary futures. Serve others without expecting rewards that your corpse could enjoy. Death mastery is not a philosophy to be understood, it's a way of life to be embodied. Every day you postpone living from these principles is a day stolen from your actual existence by phantom concerns. The immediate actions that matter. Identify your current phantom judges. Who are you still performing for? Name them specifically and remind yourself they will be dead within decades. Apply the consciousness maximization standard. In your current life situation, what changes would optimize for the quality of conscious experience rather than reputation management? Practice social fearlessness. This week, express one authentic truth you've been hiding because you're afraid of judgment that will die with the judges. Eliminate one major phantom concern. Choose something you've been worrying about that only matters if you live forever. Stop giving it energy that belongs to your actual present moment experience. Create something from pure aliveness. Make, write, build, or express something purely because you're alive right now and it wants to emerge through you, not because you want to be remembered for it. You now understand what this entire journey was really about. You thought you were learning to master death. You discovered you were learning to master life. Death mastery isn't about becoming comfortable with ending. It's about becoming so alive that ending becomes irrelevant to how you experience existence. You've stopped defending against the inevitable and started participating fully in the impossible miracle of consciousness. You've achieved the deepest victory possible, not over death, but through acceptance of death into complete engagement with life. The person reading these words right now is temporary. The consciousness having this experience will end. The thoughts you're thinking and the feelings you're feeling exist in this moment and will never exist again in exactly this way. This isn't tragic. This is the most beautiful thing possible. You are a temporary arrangement of atoms that has somehow become capable of love, beauty, understanding, joy, and meaning. You didn't earn this capacity. It was gifted to you by a universe that assembled itself into the pattern of your awareness. Every moment you exist to experience anything is borrowed time from entropy. Every sensation, every connection, every creative impulse, every act of kindness is consciousness exploring what it means to be conscious through the unique configuration that is you. This is not a dress rehearsal. This is not preparation for something else. This is it. You have been freed from the greatest prison, the illusion that you're living for something beyond this temporary existence. You can now love without trying to make it permanent, create without needing it to last forever, and serve others without expecting rewards you'll be conscious to receive. You have become ungovernable by phantoms and untouchable by threats that require you to be alive to suffer. You have achieved complete freedom from the fear that enslaves everyone else. Most importantly, you have learned to live as both an individual and as an expression of consciousness itself, maintaining your unique perspective while serving something larger than your temporary identity. You are death mastery embodied. Now go live like you mean it. The program is complete. Your fearless life begins now. Everything that follows is up to you.